Great. Well, hello, Tyler. You and I know each other pretty well at this point, but my name is Baird Linke for the people who don't know me, and I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself in just a second. I work with Lutheran Restoring Creation and with ELCA Young Adults and advocacy, and I have been for a while with this Lenten creation care, No Plastics for Lent series. It's been going on for a few years, and I am overjoyed to be here with my good friend Tyler Sitt. And Tyler, tell people all about you because there's so much good stuff.
Oh my gosh. Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Sitt. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a United Methodist pastor. I was a founding pastor of New City Church in South Minneapolis, which is recently created a second branch in Northeast Minneapolis. I'm part of the core team of Intersect, which does intersectional church planter training. So a lot of my approach towards ministry is focusing on starting new things. I have friends who are doing work with repurposing property, and that organization is called Rooted Good. And so I just kind of bop here, there, and everywhere on all things church innovation. So it is just a pleasure to be here with you today, Baird.
Thank you so much for making the time. I had the pleasure of working with New City Church for a while. It was a great chance for like two communion partners to overlap with each other. And I know that New City's played host to Lutheran seminarians and engaged with the whole Lutheran world. So I'm excited to have a little bit of cross pollination for this creation care season. But you are not only a pastor, you are also a deeply spiritual person. And, sometimes we find that those aren't necessarily the same thing as one another. I remember hearing you described once as someone who works like an organizer and prays like a mystic. And I think that that's a accurate description of who you are and what you do. And so I wanted to start hearing just a little bit about uh, New City Church being grounded around environmental justice, what it's like to build spiritual community in that space. And then we're going to start pivoting more into conversation about spiritual practice for us as Christians engaged as citizens in the world, and especially bearing in mind that this is an election year and that the world's on fire and that we have a lot of work to do vis-a-vis climate change during this
Yes.
election year. And how to stay,
Yeah.
rooted is one of the words you used earlier. And let's go with that. So tell us the origins
Praise
of
God.
New City Church.
I mean, my orientation towards ministry is basically entirely resting upon deep experiences that I've had of God in worship services and small groups and prayer, but also certainly through nature. Like that was just so clearly part of my spiritual formation story. And especially as a member of the LGBTQ community, like nature was a really important part before I came out. Like nature kind of accepted me as I was before like other people could. And so I've always seen nature as integral to not only like climate change justice, which is of course what we're here to talk about, but also just kind of all the other types of justice, because nature is a testimony to God and
Mm,
shows like the reality of God in our lives. And so a lot of my ministry is just responsive to God being real as I've experienced God through these very deep things. And
mm.
yeah, if any of those pieces weren't there, if nature wasn't there, if prayer wasn't there, if community wasn't there, then I certainly wouldn't be who I am today.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So we're here
And this is,
to
by the
talk.
way, I don't know if folks know like Baird's backstory as well, but like we've had so many conversations about just like wow, hiking and prayer and advocating for people who are being crushed by society sure seems to flex very similar muscles. So
Yeah.
like all of that uh braiding together, I think is something that we as Christians are really incentivized to do.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that's right. And, you're right. We've had all these conversations about how thinking ecologically and thinking spiritually about the world are really closely related to one another. It's all about the relationships, unexpected and really inescapable, between the things that you might want to.
Yes.
It would be much more convenient, maybe, or efficient to cordon off these different aspects of ourselves, of our world, of our country, our communities into these like self-contained units. And that's just not what reality reflects. And if we're going to engage, hopefully responsibly, with all of those parts of ourselves and of the world, that taking that kind of total view into focus, even as we pay attention to the particular, is both a really demanding but really rewarding way of moving through the world, I think. So and you've,
Absolutely.
yeah, and you're well known for being able to just put that so succinctly. In fact, you've written books about it in many different occasions, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you about spiritual practices in particular. You wrote a book called Staying Awake, which are grounded in
Mhm.
spiritual practice. I was wondering if you could start off the conversation just describing what spiritual practices are and why we would do them as Christians, as citizens, as people who are concerned about our communities, ecological and municipal or national.
Yeah. Yeah. I always flirt around with these different metaphors, but I think spiritual practices are kind of like a rhythm that you create in your own life so that all of who you are can encounter God a little bit more every time you do it. Is kind of the goal. And there's a couple pieces there. So one is spiritual practices require a certain type of discipline is such a gross word, but a certain type of like continuity, like you're intentionally trying to do a thing again and again and again, and letting it shape your lifestyle. Um, it involves all of who you are. So certainly, like as a mystic, I really believe that our bodies themselves can sense and feel God, have an experiential knowing of God, but that also involves emotions, and that also involves thoughts and words and plans. So all of those things in conjunction together are really exciting to me. And then lastly, like personally, I can't really divorce spiritual practices from the reality of God. So when people are
Mm,
like, I have a spiritual practice, and it's I go surfing, and I'm like, cool. So like how, but do you connect with God through that? And they're like, no, I just kind of like to surf. Like, that's a little bit more like a hobby, like a cool hobby than a spiritual practice. But what I'm talking about is like there's some type of contact with something greater than yourself that like
mm.
certainly can't be confined by words or names, but like words and names are very helpful to approach and understand.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by spiritual practice. Yeah.
Totally. I think that's really helpful. There are a lot of things that can be spiritual practices, but just because they can be doesn't mean they necessarily are, unless there's the right attention paid to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's like just about anything can become a spiritual practice, and just about anything can become not a spiritual practice. You know,
Hmm.
like it's like I know lots of folks who go to church every week, and during prayer time, they're texting to their friends because they're completely checked out. And like just because you are in a room where a prayer is being said doesn't necessarily mean that it's a spiritual practice.
Mm.
So like it
Hmm.
it really is about like you showing up to the practice with the entirety of who you are. That's a key component to all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. We hear so much about the people who are spiritual but not religious. And I think that we could probably talk about the people who are religious without being spiritual. But that's a different conversation,
Honestly, I'm
maybe.
concerned more about the latter. But okay, yeah. We we
For
we have to
real,
go.
for
Yeah,
real.
let's.
But we could go a lot of different directions, and we'll probably circle back around to that. Uh, so I think that that's a really helpful framing of this desire to continually encounter God through these practices, and I love the consistency being a part of it. I think that that's uh like the less sexy part of spiritual practice. We
Yeah.
want like the lights shining through and everything illuminated, but we don't always like the showing up over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's where some of the magic happens, because I do think that when we're grounding ourselves in that relationship with God, in that relationship to wholeness and healing,
Mm,
and
mm,
I really think like the healing part of that is important. That it's a process. We're not jumping to healed. We're in the middle of healing, and that's
yeah.
what God is up to in a
Ooh,
lot of
that's
the
good.
world. Thank you. I thought so too. So as we're approaching these things in a year that I think some people have anxieties about, and that could be taxing on us in ways that maybe make us show up in ways that we don't want to. I can think back to previous election years for my own self and know
Mm.
that I wasn't really like overflowing with the fruits of the spirit during those times. Uh, my patience and humility and kindness and my hope weren't all just like firing on all cylinders. And
Right.
personally speaking, a lot of that anxiety comes to me around environmental care, creation care, and particularly about climate change, and knowing in some ways, the stakes of the decisions that we're making right now, not just for my life, but for the generations that will follow, and feeling both very small and also
Yeah.
probably like more important than I should, but only in terms of like the damage
Right.
I can do. I oversell the damage I can do and I
Right.
undersell the good. And I'd like to go into this election year, and I think a lot of people would, taking those stakes very seriously and not saying, like, well, it's not good for my mental health to be engaged with these things. So I'm going to self care my way out of it. We're not going to self care our way out of climate change. And that doesn't mean that it's not important
Yes.
to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
Yeah.
would you be counseling people to bear in mind? Let's go like general election years overall. Like, what are the dynamics at play that can be spiritually tempting to people that other other groups might know really well
Mm,
how to like play upon those temptations? And
mhm.
also, from your perspective as a minister and as an organizer, spiritually, how should we be orienting ourselves to something that's this important, uh, and also so emotionally trying? I think because of that importance. That was a lot to throw at you all
Yeah.
at once. You can take them one by one.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think um there's so much there's so much gift in the practice of prayer, but also the entirety of the gospel message that can support us in this moment. That honestly, like I'm in lots of community organizer circles, and I literally don't understand how someone could really engage in this work in an ongoing way without being a person of faith, just
Mm,
because of how much discouragement comes from it. Like truly,
yeah.
and I'm inspired by um, points of Christian history and certainly in the Bible of people who really had zero options of a future and still found prayer as an amazing way to connect with something that gave them a sense of hope. You know, we're recording this in the season of Lent, and Lent is when we remember that there was a Friday and even a Saturday where the disciples had all of their hope taken away from them violently and acutely. So, like, right there, embedded within our liturgical season, is a reminder that the despair that we feel in our lives and in our world
Mm,
is not unique to the modern cacophony that we've created for ourselves, but like a deeply a human experience that God has been accompanying for a long time. I think back to during the HIV, very early in the HIV/AIDS crisis, back before they even knew the name of the disease, they called it gay cancer. And gay cancer had a 0% survival rate. And the LGBT community still organized when there was a 0% survival rate of a disease that they didn't know how it was transmitted.
Mm.
So, like, we have these contexts of and
Yeah.
stories of people who were like, yeah, we literally have no meaningful response and we're just randomly dying. And yet we can continue to
Mm.
strive toward a connection with God that sustains us. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think that climate change is is an epic version of all of this. Like there's a 0% survival rate of the whole world being on fire as well. But it's certainly not more epic than literally the savior being executed by the state. Like
Right.
it's definitely bad. It's definitely not worse than the Lamb of God being
Mhm.
slain in front of everyone. So I think
Right.
part of the invitation as we're grappling with the peril that we're witnessing is to practice the curiosity of like, is it possible that God has something to say to me even when I'm feeling a real and sober despair that is
Mm.
factually grounded? Like it's not just like
Yeah.
despair, like, oh, it's not that bad, but like, what happens if it actually is pretty bad? Does God have something to say there? And
Right.
like spiritual practices are just kind of like continually trying to revisit that question and create that space until we hear a response.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like how you put that. And I think a lot of people's uh maybe their hackles might be raising just a little bit because they've had the experience of someone coming to them in moments of despair and trying to use God cheaply to just get through it. Well,
Yeah.
the tomb's still empty. It's like that can be true and is in fact,
Right.
and this sucks. and
Right.
and I think that being able to hold those things in tension with each other is that is where we meet God primarily, is in the space between those
Yeah.
two truths. That Holy Saturday moment of we don't see a way out. The disciples didn't see a way out either.
Yes.
But that's I think where trust comes into play rather than like having opinions about how the world is trusting that that is actually the reality there. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, yeah. So in an election year, what are the things that might get in the way of us sitting with that?
Yeah. So I see people over and over again um, oscillating between really big feelings, rage or despair, or, like really consuming emotions, and then kind of like flopping to the other side and numbing out or having a collapse response. We sometimes talk about with like somatics and embodiment, having a collapse response where it's like, okay, I'm either like so mad about this, or I'm like doing absolutely nothing and scrolling on my phone. And it's just kind of this carnival back and forth
Mm.
between these two that will destroy us. Like I've just seen it again and again that like human
Mhm.
lives are not meant to oscillate between that in a sustained way. So I think spiritual practices are in an election year particularly is trying to find another way to relate
Mm.
to the despair of our world, where it's like, is it possible to have big feelings without being run by those big feelings? Like, can the big feelings be on the bus without driving the bus? And is
Mm.
it
Mhm.
possible to lessen our pain or soothe ourselves without completely collapsing into a zombie numbness that like takes us away from society? And I
Yeah.
think spiritual practice is like many disciplines are observe kind of a third way in this, including in organizing and in therapy. Like, are there other ways to do this? But I think that spiritual practice is saying like, I can't. I insistently believe that God doesn't want me to either be panicking or a zombie for my entire life. So,
Mm.
so what is
Mhm.
the other option besides that?
Right. And I think that that's such a big contrast to our political system, which, especially during an election year, wants people
Oh
either
my
to be
gosh.
panicking or zombies. Like, that's how the parties benefit, is when you have your group of people who are full blown panicking, who are going to be activated to vote against the other person, even if they're not necessarily voting for you per se. And then
Right.
you want everyone else to be a zombie. You want everyone else to be
Right.
too shut down to engage. And contrasting the way, like, the goals that these groups have for us and our well-being versus the goals that God has for us of life and life
Oh
abundantly.
my gosh.
And I think recognizing when when another group is trying to sell us, like, this is how you have to be, and God is saying, maybe there's a lot of things that are true about this, but there are other things that are true as well. And hopefully that
Yes.
can keep our heads
And like maybe Democrats and Republicans don't have the most important truth in general, like maybe there's something beyond
weird.
this. Yeah, go figure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have uh many children in my life. I just my nephew's 6 months old. And one of the things that I'm observing in children is like um the relationship between crying out for help and receiving help, and how kids will escalate their acting out if they're not getting
Mm,
help, right? And so it's like they a kid asks for something or yells for something and it doesn't happen, and then they're thrown down a chair, and then they get in trouble. But it's like, well, some of it is just trying to get it upstream, and I feel like what we're seeing in politics are just like kids acting out like to the highest degree. But I can't help but acknowledge that that's because like people aren't able to engage on lower levels of activation. And so it's like, well, we have to. When I talk to campaign managers, they're like, we have to make it sound like this is the end of the world if they don't get people out,
right.
because that's the only thing that gets people out. And so
Right.
like I feel like some of the way that we could heal our system is like, hey, organizers, I'll show up how I'm going to show up without you having to make this like the literal apocalypse every time you're asking for me to make a donation. And like
Right.
having a little bit more intentionality in that regard. But yeah, we're
Mhm.
just miles and miles and miles away from from that reality. So pray.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, as we're having this conversation, I'm seeing the parallels between, like, these kind of fringe churches that are so obsessed with the end of the world because that's how they get people through the
Mhm.
door. And in
Wow.
both cases, I feel that that's kind of spiritually manipulative and spiritually abusive. When, you know,
Wow.
I don't expect politicians to be spiritual or anything. I guess I shouldn't have that expectation out there. Um,
But it sure would be
we would,
nice if
it would
they
be so
were.
nice, but I shouldn't put my eggs in that basket. But on the other hand, like, it's clear that this is not, it's not a system that's interested in, like, spiritual reflection. And
Right.
unless it results in panic or zombie. And
Yeah.
what we see, I think, is a similar trend where people who've been raised in these churches that are so high stakes all the time, no joy, like,
Right.
we'll find joy when
Right.
you're dead. And
Right.
they leave. And instead of being able to get the
Wow.
gifts of being in spiritual community with one another, instead of receiving well the gifts that God is trying to give, they just don't engage anymore. And that's a totally understandable response. And it makes me kind of
Sure.
sad because there's so much good stuff available. Um,
Wow.
it's yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that I was wondering about is, when you are engaged in conversation with people who are children of God during an election cycle, where all of the forces swirling around us want us to be like, that's an enemy.
Right.
How do you recommend people to, like, stay in the truth of who God says this person is, even while disagreeing with them about like incredibly important things. But are they more important than this person's humanity? I don't know. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
how do you
yeah.
respond to that?
Um, so I guess I would initially just name like social media is not it for me. Like it is just not engineered to have meaningful or transformative conversations, period. So like any amount of time that people who care about justice or new world or care about God's love, like any time that is dedicated to like batting back trolls, I
Mm,
just don't see that. Like just block the guy, end of engagement. Like I just don't see social media as the place to do that. Okay, so assuming that we're talking about interpersonally,
mm,
two things that we're not going to do. So we're not going to do this like, well, we're just going to like, everyone's going to go along to get along. And that means that whenever someone says something harmful against people who are being crushed by society, that we're just going to be fine with it. Like
right.
that is not meaningful engagement, right? So we're not going to do that. But we're also not going to do this like social justice purity culture thing where we are like we have an ethic of purity of if you're not saying the exact same thing as I'm saying, then like you are forever the devil and done with. You know, like I think neither of those are desirable or neither of those lead to real substantive change.
Mm,
So I tend to think of it more about how can we stay attuned to each other? How can we be tracking each other, even like praying through the words as you're hearing
mm.
them hit your brain and then sizzling because of how wrong they are? Like, how can we kind of like prayerfully stay in the heat of it?
Mm,
And yeah, I don't know. I'm on a lot of panels that are talking about what are we going to do about the polarity in our country? What are we going to do about people going this way and that way? And I have such a struggle with that word polarity being the framework
mhm.
of it because it implies, first of all, it implies that centrism is the solution to everything. Like if the problem
Right.
is polarity, and then the opposite of that is people just coming together. And centrism is really hard to create when like actual supremacists are in at the table, you know, like, okay, so there's that.
Right.
But two, I just think that the spiritual life is about creating a gap between a stimulus and your reaction to it, and being
Mm,
able to stay in the heat a little bit more. So I see what's happening in our country a little bit less a problem of polarity and a little bit more of a problem of fragility
mm,
where it's like it's not that people have differing opinions is the problem. It's our inability to stay in a healthy place in our nervous system and in our prayer life to be able to
mm.
track with that person and see them into the room, hear them into the room, even as you're responding and pushing against it in some cases very
Right.
strongly.
Yeah. I love that. That image of putting a little bit of a gap between what's happening and how I respond it. That gap being where God gets to interrupt me. That I'm
Yes.
not responding reflexively, that God gets the chance to interrupt whatever I'm about to do. I think
Yes.
even if that's just my reaction
Yes.
to it, not just my like the thing that I do in response, but also how I process it, giving God the chance to interrupt all of those
Mm,
things makes me a better person at the end of the day.
yes.
Um,
Yes.
and I don't mean that in like a holier than thou, but like
Yeah.
I am
Just
functioning
a more
better
whole person.
as a
Yeah, just like a
person.
healthy, just a human. Yeah. And I think about like Jesus, you know, everyone was getting ready to stone someone, and Jesus was like, okay, just give me a second to draw on the ground, and then I'm going to respond. Like that,
Yes.
I kind of feel like that's the moment where it's like, okay, in the face of this, I'm not allowing myself to give this like instant reaction, but I'm also definitely going to respond. You know,
Mm.
like
Mhm.
Jesus wasn't like, I'm
Mhm.
going to draw and then leave. Jesus was like, I'm going to draw and then interrupt violence.
Right.
And like, I just love that as a modality for how Christians can show up to the world.
I think that's such a good example. And it's a perfect segue now into looking ahead to this year. Any spiritual practices, any of those interruptions, the doodles, the prayers that you would commend to folks? Um, Clearly, it's not a one size fits all kind of thing, but to get people's imaginations firing about how they might place those gaps for themselves while they're going about their
Yeah.
citizenship as a Christian
Oh
this year.
Lord have mercy. Yeah. I mean, I think um yeah, of course that you're welcome to check out Staying Awake, the Gospel for Change Makers for more thoughts on 9 practices that Christians I think in particular our tradition has honed very well. But most broadly speaking, I'm like, okay, uh when are you accountable to your people? So like as you're going about your business, as you're posting these things online, like when are the folks who are know you well enough to call you back in, like when are you checking in with them? So like
Mm,
relationships feel key to this.
yeah.
2 is like when are you engaging God's dream for the world? And
Mm,
usually that means scriptural study or, like some type of biblical or church history kind of thing. But like, you know, the point isn't the election. The point is the kingdom of God, and the election is very
mm,
helpful to shape it in one way or the other. So
mhm,
like always kind of like what is the bigger dream that we're trying to work on? And then lastly, like just letting your body reset after big flares of big emotions so that you feel a sense of generativity, freshness, openness, and curiosity,
mhm.
which I know feels like a long ways away for us who are working on the campaign. But like the goal is like, if we just let the election traumatize us and then we act out from that trauma, who really wins?
Mhm.
So like really trying to cycle that all the way through. And prayer is just an amazingly helpful instrument for that.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Tyler. That's all the time that we're going to take from you on your busy schedule. But thank you so much for making the time to talk about this. And I hope that I know it's been helpful for me, and I'm excited for the conversations that are come from our groups as they listen to these conversations and start to bring them
Yay!
into their own neighborhoods. So
God
thank
bless
you.
y'all. Thank you all so much. And feel free to check out my latest book, Where We Meet. It's a Lenten devotional if you're
Oh,
looking
how
for some
timely.
prayers. Oh, me, oh my. So thank you, Baird, so much. And God bless all y'all who are listening to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. Bye bye.